Hello,
Okay.
everyone.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Marcel. Feel free to chat with us. So this is the workshop looking at neurotechnology and big data. Hi, Anu. And we're here to think about this special set and very exciting set of challenges as part of the think tank session of the Neurotech. Part of the Neurotech inauguration. So you're very, very welcome. And so Nick Irving, who some of you will have seen this morning, he presented our work package and also appeared on some cameos, and Zoltan's Thomas Willis presentation is here with me. And between the two of us, we're going to try to manage this new technology, speaking of neurotechnology. So what I'll do is I'll just introduce some of the topics, and because the topics are quite different, neurotechnology and big data, I thought if everyone was happy with this, that we could sort of do them in sort of a show of two halves. We'll talk about some of the neurotechnology issues first, and then discuss those for a while, and then move on over to the big data part, and then maybe at the end we can pull some of them together. And to be honest, from my point of view, I think one of the most interesting things for today is actually maybe not just coming up with answers to the questions, but actually coming up with the right questions that we should be thinking about and working on over the next few years. So Nick, if we can get started, if we go to the next slide, please. So if we start with neurotechnology, I thought, I don't know about you, but I thought that a good place to start was to think about what does this term actually mean. I think the most conventional definition of the term is the set of methods and instruments that connect technical devices and the nervous system in order to either monitor brain activity, extend brain activity, or alter brain activity. I think we could also consider methods that simulate or are inspired by brain activity in order to produce behavior or to interface with other technical devices, also as falling within this broad category. But I wondered whether people in the audience might have had other views or other ideas about this. So I think what we'll try to do is get people to put suggestions and things through the ask a question function. So if you think there's something that is been left out, feel free to put that in ask a question or even use chat. Otherwise, let me know if you think that this is a good starting point for us to launch from. Any new suggestions, or are we good to go on these two ideas? I'm going to do the Oxford thing and take silence as we're good to go. Yeah? Anybody want to say yes? Okay. So let's start then, assuming that this is a good set of methods, instruments, and algorithms. Great. And algorithms, I think we can add to that. Excellent. Okay. So if we think about then in the sort of most conventional way of the definition of neurotechnology, today from Zoltan's presentation, we saw that people have been trying to figure out the brain and how it works for a long time, and initially things were based really on clinical observations and on dissections, as we saw today, going back 400 years. But possibly the birth of sort of neuroscience, as we know it, in terms of our ability to measure, monitor, change brain activity, probably goes back about just over 100 years ago. So about 100, and we had the birth. We had some ignominious start with some of the phrenologists, but shortly after that, we had, the sort of revolution of the neurologists like Broca and Wernicke and many others in the late 1800s who were sort of linking lesions in the brain to clinical symptoms and attributing changes in behavior to the brain. But the technologies to image the brain probably started off sort of, there were two types. One is like the series of electrophysiology methods, and the other with the brain imaging methods. And I tried to sort of put some pictures here to illustrate sort of the changes in the methodologies that we go to. So the upper left is actually Hans Berger, who developed the EEG in like very early 1900s. So EEG and the brain imaging methods kind of competed on the early years as to which one was going to take off first. I think the neurophysiology ones took off first. But at the same time that Berger was developing, a little bit before actually, he was developing the EEG methods, people like Roy Sherrington here in Oxford were observing the link between blood and brain activity and planting the seeds also to develop the brain imaging methods. So the next really funky slide here is something that I actually discovered putting this presentation together, this picture with this man lying down in a blue thing. That's actually Marcus Raichle, who in 1980s, with some other researchers, climbed up a very high mountain and injected themselves with radioactive xenon, and then used these scintillator detectors that are on his head to measure brain activity coming up there. And so from this are the origin of PET scans as we know them. Next one is a CT scan. And then later in the 1990s, the MRI methods were developed. Then the MEG methods were also being developed, which superseded or improved some of the EEG methods. And methods are still developing now at an astonishing pace. So the little kid wearing a sort of spaghetti bowl upside down on their head is actually dawning what is going to be the new generation of the ways to measure brain activity with optically pumped magnetometers. So these are going to be wearable MEG devices. And you can see on the bottom row sort of the improvements of the kind of resolution that we've had in the human brain, looking at the human brain, you know, from things like X-rays to being able to see sort of that canonical image there of PET scans showing activities in different parts of the brains coming out of the work of Marcus Raichle's group. And then the classic first science cover showing the MRI study with that head that's with a bit of brain exposed, looking at visual cortex activation using functional MRI. Nowadays, you know, we use MRI. The next slide is from sort of the many different types of, Nick, go back, please. Is the many different kinds of images that we have with MR, that we can get structure, function, connectivity, diffusion, vasculature. We can see all of that. And the last one is kind of the new version of the EEG with the MEG, where you can actually pull apart all the different frequencies embedded inside the signals in the brain by using empirical mode decomposition and other really advanced methods. And this is all, of course, just with the human brain, and the granularity that we get with the animal brains is even more astonishing. So these are all methods that are continuing to develop for us to look at brain activity. If we go to the next one, we also have next slide, that we can extend or alter brain activity. So again, people have been playing around with these ideas for a long time, looking at, so these are the first thing on the upper left is someone trying to, you know, use magnetism to change brain activity. But of course, we know now that we actually can do that. So the next slide is actually Roger Penfield. This is the original invasive ways in surgery when they could stimulate the human brain. But then, of course, now we can do this non-invasively. So the next two slides are actually from, the next three slides are from work here in Oxford, sort of using transcranial magnetic stimulation, using direct transcranial direct current stimulation, and also new methods being developed on the right-hand corner there are using ultrasound to stimulate in the depths of the brain, and most of the work still being done on animal models, but with the hope to do this in human brain in the future as well. And these methods have been used in a variety of different ways. And the next click, Nick, shows that on the leftmost image there is that, you know, we're using this for very important reasons, for example, clinically. So this is a paraplegic man who's using his brain through brain control interface machines to actually have his first beer that he's been able to have on his own. But obviously nowadays you can actually buy, transcranial direct stimulation devices for your brain on Amazon. There's one you can buy, the one that the lady, and you can control it from her phone. It's 200 pounds. And also now we can also be developed brain-computer interface devices for gaming and all kinds of just entertainment issues. So, and again, this is the human work, which obviously always lags behind what we can do with animal models. So this is a bit of a background, but if we go to the next slide, here's a set of questions that I thought we could start thinking about. First of all, which of these neurotechnologies are really the most useful for understanding human health and education? And what do we think is on the horizon? What do you think, like in 2040, what kinds of neurotechnologies might we be wearing, for example, and how might these be changing the ways we interact with our world? And then the next question is, what are the greatest challenges? All of these methods are different and they provide us with different information. So what are the greatest challenges of bridging understanding across data obtained with different technologies? And in fact, are some of these technologies leading us to misconceptions? Are they fooling us or actually giving us, misleading us by providing only partial information, and that we might not acknowledge that properly? And then I guess going to the algorithms part is whether some of the algorithms being developed nowadays, especially those simulating or inspired by brain activity, whether they're actually telling us anything really useful about how the human mind and brain work, and what are their greatest promises and limitations. So these were some questions that I thought we could get going, but you guys may have other questions. So Anu, you had a question. I'm not sure I understand exactly. Do you want to, Nick, can you bring Anu to the stage and maybe she can tell us what she's...
Okay, just give me a moment. Just bear with me, Anu. This is new technology for us. You should be with us in a moment, Anu.
If other people have other questions or ideas, please feel free to contribute.
Oh, Anu has not joined us.
Okay. So Anu says, I'm more interested in what ways your work borders on with EBI's current work. So could you elaborate on main areas of interest? So
I think that's bioinformatics, Kia.
Okay, right. So maybe that we're going to get to the big data bit in a moment. Okay, Marcel says, my feeling is that invasive methods will be needed to achieve the precision to optimally control and read out brain activity. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, and I don't know, Nick, if you want to bring Marcel up as well. So one of the things that I think is really, really challenging is that ultimately we need to go from very granular understanding, as you say, maybe understanding things at the level of, I don't know what you think the right level of granularity is for us to understand the computational principles in a brain. But let's say it might be cellular or subcellular levels. But ultimately, we need to scale up that understanding to understand the principles of the whole system. And actually stitching between those different levels of analysis, I think, is one of the biggest challenges, sort of like abstracting what's important at a granular level to carry up to the next level. So I think that is one of the most difficult, because all of us talk about, like, we all know these levels of levels of analysis or levels of abstraction. We see these diagrams, but actually making that stitching between the levels is really, really tricky.
Hi, Marcel.
Hi, hello.
Hi. So what do you think about that?
Hey. Yeah, so it's difficult. So I started off in non-invasive methods myself. But if I look at the current landscape in the Netherlands, there's lots of work focusing on more invasive technology. Of course, the hard part is how do you bridge that towards human applications. But still, I have the feeling that in the Netherlands, this is really the current movement, developing more advanced neurotechnologies that allow us to probe and stimulate increasingly large numbers of neurons in real time. But that's one particular direction, right? And it's less portable and less transportable to human applications.
Well, I think it is now, but I mean, in the future, so like one thing, so first of all, I think the issue of like, what are the relevant levels of analysis to look at things? So for example, from my point of view, cells are not an exciting level of analysis. The interesting level of analysis might be very small circuits that are performing computations, which involve cells, but they involve not, you have to kind of extricate the circuits from different bits of the, either within a region or across regions. Those are really hard to get to with any method that we have nowadays. And of course, in humans, it's at the moment impossible to target individual cells or individual microcircuits non-invasively, for example. But in the future, if we develop much, much better types of, let's say, stimulating electrodes, right? So even nowadays, even in animals, we have to usually implant electrodes that are very thin and stuff, but there's still wires that are crossing through brains. But people are developing kind of dust electrodes and other kinds of things, which will completely change that landscape, I think. And some of that might be portable to humans one day. So
so I'll also post one message in the chat. So that's very recent work also of people I'm involved in a Dutch consortium. And this is really about stimulating early visual cortex in monkeys with the ultimate aim of reinstantiating vision or perception in the blind. So these things are indeed slowly starting to appear.
Yeah, but I think in terms of the levels of analysis, I think one thing that has been missing in a lot of the really excellent pioneering work in the modern neuroscience, I guess since the 50s, is that a lot of the movement has been very bottom up. So like from the Hubel and Wiesel kind of approach, looking at single cells and trying to build things up. And I think what we need is to apply to our science a bit of how the brain works, which is a combination of this bottom up and top down. So I think some of the lousy broad methods that we have, imaging and MEG and things, they can sort of give us a sense of where some interesting terrains are, so to get people to then be able to go granular, and might give us some principles of like how are things coordinated, or who are players of certain networks. So those kinds of things, I think we need to use both of the types of methods in an iterative format. And I don't think that crosstalk happens as fruitfully as it could.
Yeah. And I basically think that's the hardware part. Of course, there's also the algorithmic part, which I kind of alluded to. I think a large part of the answer is not only developing improved hardware, but also realizing that this is really a fundamental AI problem to solve. So how do you optimally stimulate a complex system in order to achieve certain objectives? That's, from my perspective, I'm an AI researcher. It's basically what we need to crack. Also on the algorithmic side.
Yeah, okay. So Alpe, you had also a comment here on mathematical modeling. Do you want to come up if you're around? Maybe we could discuss that as well. Nick, can you bring Alpe up? Oskan? I think we're all crowdcast novices here.
Yes.
We're like Zoom natives, or And I think this is also something, Nick, I can't hear you, but are you there?
Alpe's coming on, I think.
Okay. And then Burak, you also mentioned about connectomes. I think that is a really interesting topic to discuss. Maybe we can also bring Burak over.
Okay, just inviting Burak.
And
Yeah,
you guys,
we're all struggling here, but we'll manage somehow. But I think this issue of AI.
Hi,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
I
Yes.
finally managed to join.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you want to share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, actually, I was just looking at the slide that you shared and the questions that you put forward. And I was actually most intrigued with the last one, where you asked how deep networks taught us anything about the workings of human mind and brain. It looks like a very natural path, actually, to try to apply the current deep learning technologies to the to understanding and maybe simulating how the brain works. Yet it is not, as everybody knows, it is not that easy. It is not actually easy at all with current technology. But that's why I said maybe it's a fruitful approach to go from a coarse scale to a fine scale, because I mean we know a lot of things, bits and pieces about the brain. We know something about the structural connectome. We know something about the functional connectome, but at a macro scale, not at a neuron scale. We know something about the bolt signals. The fMRI tells us. We know something about MEG, some EEG. Everything tells something different. Everything tells something about the brain, about a single object, single entity, but at a different scale from a different perspective. And we just struggle, at least I just mainly struggle to put things together. What we are doing in my group is mainly working with structural and functional connectomes derived from MRI data. I mean, fMRI for functional, diffusion MRI for structural, and we are, trying to apply algorithms or data analytics, trying to identify how the networks change through the course of dementia, for example, things like that. Okay, so these are algorithms. But while we are doing this, we inevitably get into questions or thoughts about applying AI or machine learning in a more general sense to these questions. And when the question comes to that, when the question comes to work thinking about how could actually AI be of any help to us in understanding or in solving our problems, then the natural question comes, and wouldn't it be possible actually to build a very simple brain, so to speak, a brain of like, I don't know, 100 neurons maybe, okay, that does very, very simple tasks with the information that we already have and with the computational capacity that we already have? Wouldn't it be a good, nice, big leap forward if we can achieve this at some point? So that's why I just put forward this idea of maybe we can go after some digital brain, not very ambitious, but at a lower ambition level, at a coarser scale, but trying to put all these bits and pieces together. I mean, I do not know MEG, I do not know EEG that much, but I know MRI, I know the algorithms. I do not know cells, I don't know how they work, but some of us do know how these cells work. And that knowledge, that insight about the cell's inner workings may actually guide the guys like us who can work on the AI side and build some algorithmic structures, architectures.
Mm-hmm.
That may help.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And I mean, I think people have, there have been different attempts at doing that, what you suggest. So one classic attempt, like I guess it must have been in the 80s, was that they were using very simple model systems. So there's this particular stomatogastric ganglion of the lobster or some shellfish or something, where they knew every single neuron and all their properties and the biophysical properties. And so they modeled this to try to sort of model the behavior. And so they've actually simulated the whole thing, and basically the ganglion didn't work in the end. It was like a great failure, but something that they learned a lot from. So that was, let's say, maybe nowadays people have done this successfully. I actually don't know whether this has been repeated now in light of the advances of the field since then. The other thing, obviously, that's been happening is like the Big Brain project, right? That's kind of run from.
That was too ambitious.
Yeah, but I think it illustrates. Yeah, that was a very ambitious thing. But again, it probably did not bring together all the people with all the different types of knowledge. And I think that's what I was saying. That I think some of the attempts have been very much like bottom up. Like you get a cell, we have these, we model the action potential, we link them up these ways. But it hasn't had that crosstalk with like, okay, what have we learned in terms of like, diffusion MRI or EEG connectivity?
Yeah.
So I think it's like understanding what it is in each of these levels that's computationally relevant and using that to stitch things together. I think that's the really big, exciting, and difficult challenge. And I think you're right that the only way we're going to know if we're right or not is by trying to simulate it and model it.
A quick comment. One is about the experiment that you mentioned, like from years ago, which I do not know, actually, my mistake. As you know, the artificial neural networks didn't work for years. I mean, people have been working with artificial networks for years, and they didn't work until recently. So there is some sort of a threshold probably in technological capabilities that we have. And when you pass that threshold, some things that do not seem to work starts to work in a kind of a miraculous way. Actually, it's not miraculous, but it's just a threshold. So it may be that we might have already passed some thresholds that we are not aware of at some point. So we may be able to do some stuff. And the second last comment, I'll leave the stage. The bottom-up approach of modeling or trying to simulate the brain based on physics is really, really too complex, and is really, really too ambitious. But if we actually go from target a certain task a brain does, for example, okay, and then if we just try to build something that looks like the brain but does this task only, then in that case, the model that we build may be trained using the machine learning approaches, using those data that we gather, EEGs, MEGs, and fMRIs. Then it will not be the brain, it will not be simulating the brain, but it would be some machine that does a certain work.
Yeah, and we have good examples of that with Google DeepMind and playing Go and stuff. I mean, I think, from my point of view, one of the things that is interesting and maybe problematic is that those machines, they're loosely brain inspired, not completely. They are built to perform a human-like task. They do it very well. And then somehow many people make this back inference that we're actually learning something about how the brain works from this, but maybe we're not, because that was purpose-built to perform that task. And one of the real, hallmarks of animal or natural brains is their flexibility. So they can do many different things. They can perceive, they can play Go, they can read, they can dance, they can do all kinds of things. Whereas these like purpose-built machines, they do that thing that they're built for, and they don't have that kind of multiplicity of potential as the brains do. And I think that's something that we should it's not a limitation of the people doing these simulations. It's something that we should keep in mind as a hallmark of our adaptive, flexible brains as well. So I think these are really, really difficult challenge. But one thing that this conversation has made me think is that in addition to a lot of the methodologies, like the, measuring cellular activity, measuring system activity with MR, with EEG, stimulating, optically recording, optogenetics. In addition to all these things, the analytical tools have also been going through a huge revolution, right? So statistics is completely different now. The machine learning, pattern analysis, types, so all of that is we could just apply a lot of these new tools to some of our old data, and we're going to learn a lot from that as well. So we finally have Alpay here. Do you want to say something to us?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Alpay,
Can
Alpay,
you hear me?
would you just like to introduce yourself? Because Barak comes from Bozici, and when people come on, it'd be really nice to know where they're from and maybe a little bit about what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a good
It
idea.
will be my pleasure. Can you hear me? Can
Yes.
you hear me? Excellent, excellent. I'm sorry about I had to deal with the permissions a little bit with my web browser. That's why I struggled. I am actually from the same department as Burak. I recently joined that department, which is also my alma mater. After I guess 30 years, I came back. Basically, my background was in electrical engineering and mathematics, and then the doctoral degree in systems science and mathematics. About 20 years ago, although I am unrelated to my doctoral work, I started working under the area of MRI at Washington University. And a visit to Virginia, not a visit, but I got transferred to Virginia Tech for a sleep study, where I was also working with the NIH on prostate cancer. 5 years ago, I came back to Turkey. And the current research interests are mainly under MRI, but I would like to categorize everything under system science and mathematics. And actually, that's the reason why I wrote that comment about mathematical modeling. And I'm glad actually that you had the discussion right before me, because I kind of want to follow up on what you were saying at from a bird's eye view, if you wish. Everything you talked about is concerning, if you wish, the math. Everything you said, from deep learning to modeling cell, EEG, fMRI, MRI, everything has on its basis some mathematical foundations. That this is not only for neuroscience, maybe the economics people or finance people or engineers, anybody you can imagine, are in fact maybe doing math without being aware of it. So my suggestion would be, although we talked about, we are talking about important things, how would we, for instance, like to provide the building blocks? If you want to do, I don't know, if you want to do fMRI, if you want to work with fMRI data, you need to know how to apply statistics, okay? If you want to do how neurons work, you need to know some nonlinear dynamical systems. If you want to go into the optimization, dynamical systems, in general, I want to call these things systems science. How would we introduce into this program system science and mathematics so that things could work smoother? That's basically what I wanted to stimulate.
Yeah, so that's a fact. I'm getting an echo here. Alpay, can you mute, and then maybe I will the echo.
I'll find the button and there you go.
Okay, yeah, that works. So I think that's a fascinating question. I agree with you that, inside the nature of all things probably is mathematics, or there's a mathematical description. And one of the things that has been said, about neuroscience is that, especially in the past, people they say it less now because I think we're in a transitional period, is that, we have more data than we have theories. So, and then, so I think we almost need to go from data to theories to mathematical descriptions, ultimately when we have a good understanding. So I was curious to understand from you what you think a neuroscientific mathematical description is going to look like in the end. Do you think we'll have one sort of mathematical theory? Do you think you'll have an interlinked set of systems described mathematically? How do you see a mature understanding of our field in a mathematical terms? I know that's not an easy question, but I'm just curious.
Okay, there is no way I can call myself a mathematician, so I'm more on the engineering side or applied math science side. But let's say engineering. So the way I see is that there is a problem that we would like to describe. As one of my professors from Imperial College said, mathematics does not, it is not definitely related to the real life, but this is the only strong weapon we have in our hands. So the way I see is that, for instance, you were told this is neurotechnology workshop, and you were mentioning maybe some BCIs, brain interface, or take anything. If you want to work with the EEG, you probably don't need to model to the very granular structure, to the deepest structure of the brain, or how the spikes are sending all these chemicals, but you need maybe a larger kind of model that will incorporate just what you need. Maybe I'm not explaining very well, but what I'm trying to say is that what we need would be absolutely objective dependent. If you want to build like a robot arm that is connected directly to the brain so that it will help some disabilities, then the only thing maybe we need to model is how the connections through the spinal cord, from the spinal cord through the arm, go to some electrodes and control the arm. If say you want to chase neurodegenerative diseases, and if you want to see where the damage is, maybe you don't need to learn how the cells are formed or which parts of the brain are damaged to the deepest, but you just need an imaging mathematical model, let's say, that will tell you exactly beforehand if there will be some degeneration take place in a given area of the brain. So what I'm trying to basically say is that you can go and do as fine as possible, like as deep as possible resolution in terms of mathematical modeling. But the question, I guess, would be to find for each specific application the level, the necessary level, which is not too complicated, but which is not too rough, which will just give us whatever we need to achieve. I don't know if my answer was clear,
Yes.
or a little clarity, but that's, if you wish, another challenge in determining the level of mathematical modeling.
Yeah, so I agree. I think identifying the right level of analysis for the right problem is fundamental in terms of applications. I think in terms of having an ultimate understanding of the functions of the brain, we need to be able to abstract from the different levels of analyses what may be relevant so that we can create a full theoretical mathematical understanding of the brain. But actually, I think it's probably good to go back to sort of, the purpose of Neurotech as a European university is to sort of use neuroscience and technology for the benefit of education, right? So I was wondering whether anyone here felt that any of these neurotechnologies that are being developed in humans or at the moment in animals, whether they are going to be relevant in changing the way we behave and learn and run education in the future. I think a lot of us have been really more thinking about trying to understand the brain than to apply the brain in terms of the brain power in terms of education. But I don't know if anyone feels, have things gone too far already, or are we going to basically, have extended memory systems and things helping us so that we don't, so we can use our brain power for better things? Or what do people think about that?
If I may interject, just as a simple, I carried this research with my undergrad students about 2 years ago. That was a short study, if you wish. With EEG, for instance, they are also carrying this for pilots or for drivers of long distance. There's not clear evidence yet, more work needs to be done, but it is possible perhaps to identify who really learned a task, not a task, but a skill. You can have two people driving a car, or just remember when you start driving a car for the first time, if you had a friend next to you, if he or she pushed you, that could be dangerous. After 20 years of driving, if they push you, or passenger pushes you, you just push back and nothing happens. So there's an increase in the skill level. For instance, could this be measured with EEG? Assume that you are teaching a course, you are connecting. This is far-fetched. This sounds a little bit bad, but I'm going to say it anyway. You are connecting EEG devices to your students, and you want to see who learned your linear algebra class or who was just sleeping and skipped the whole class. It's just a thought.
No, I agree. And there are lots of applications and stuff like this. Branka, you mentioned in the chat that you think the application to neurotechnologies has been under-delivered. Do you want to tell us what you mean by that, or how do you see things as working in the future would be? I mean, I can imagine, like in the past, people used to always read out loud, like nobody actually read silently. And I think the first people who read silently were some monks or something. It was considered like heretical and diabolical. And it was, and I think that maybe in the future, none of us are going to speak out loud anymore. We're not going to need.
I think we have Branka with us, Kia.
Okay. Hi, Branka. Let us know what do you think the future is going to look? Tell us about you and how we've underdeveloped some of the methods that we have.
So I'm from Nijmegen, from Radboud University and the Donda Center for Cognitive Neuroimaging. Yeah, so I think we have been doing a lot of work actually to understand human brain function, but I think we haven't really done so much to understand how human brain actually functions in naturalistic contexts. And I think there's now some work being done in like educational domain or in like neuroeconomics and decision making, which is trying to kind of like make that bridge with more, let's say, applied domains for neuroscience. But I think this also requires a lot of interdisciplinary work with people from those fields. So there's some nice work from the US where they're trying to apply, let's say, mind reading or matching between the structure of mental representations between teachers and students in physics, for example. And that's, I think, probably, a format of, let's say, neurotests, where someone is doing exams. Well, I mean, potentially could be doing exams by going into the scanner and just looking at some concepts, which might give you a better understanding of how they relate to information. But I think, if you think about it, even if this really works, do you really want to spend 500 euros per subject or per student to test their knowledge while they're looking at some pictures in the scanner, as opposed to just giving them a pen and paper test? So I think there's like the practicality of how much it costs to run neuroimaging studies, the practicality of how convenient it is. So I think the optometer MEG, for example, might improve things. And there's now, I guess, smaller EEG devices that are being developed, which might then make this sort of shift into naturalistic settings easier. But I think ultimately, so far, we haven't really done enough to bridge from basic neuroscience to applied neuroscience, I guess. And I think we need to, set up interdisciplinary collaborations basically to understand what, the educational scientists know that we just don't know yet. while also developing technologies that are, smaller scale, easier to use, cheaper, and so on.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I think maybe, there are a little bit more efforts in that regard in terms of some of the, or more investment in that regard in terms of some of the clinical applications, for example.
Yeah.
But obviously it has applications throughout. And I agree with you. I think one real difficulty is that this requires partnerships. So I think it requires not hybrid scientists who are a little bit of a neuroscientist and a little bit of an educationalist. You really need teams of people working really hard together. And I think sometimes neuroscientists, like, they just teach outward, like, oh, let me tell you about the brain, apply it like this, but they actually don't have the humility to understand the great knowledge of these other fields that also we need to iterate between. So one thing, and this also goes back to what Alpe was saying, like, obviously we know that even without a deep understanding of some things, we can make things work, right? We can get comatose people who are locked in to sort of express something with their brain in a scanner. We can get paraplegics to, have beer. We can do all kinds of things with some very rough signals that we can get from the brain. But I wonder whether one thing that hasn't happened is, again, this crosstalk between understanding some of the principles of organization of the brain, and then that feeding into technology, and also feeding into, like, how do we educate people better and stuff, and then that coming back to create better technology. So, for example, right, there's it's quite early days, I would say, but there's lots of work sort of talking about what matters going from sensory to perceptual to conceptual types of representations and organizations with, work like Nico Kriegeskorte and other people like that. But we don't seem to apply that back to sort of then educate people better, or, like that two-way communication. I don't know what people think, but I think this is an area that could be quite promising, that's also underdeveloped. The other thing that I'm always astonished about is that, most of the world's problems, global problems, rely on human decision-making, focus, motivation, all these things that we all study in neuroscience to solve, right? So, and somehow our field is not making a global impact at that level. So, I think that goes a little bit to what you were saying, Branka. I think somehow we need to be able to engage with understanding real immersive behavior of animals and of humans, and to start, using that knowledge to improve our world a little bit. So.
May I jump in?
Yes, Burak, you are so quiet there and hidden. Please jump in.
I'm here. I just didn't want to interfere. Maybe we should at some point clarify what we mean by useful neurotechnologies. I mean, what is useful? Branka has, the technology or the applications that Branka has been talking about is more like direct applications. If I may say, like consumer electronics, okay? Electronics, consumer electronics. Someone develops a transistor, that's not consumer electronic, but someone uses the transistor to build a radio, that's consumer electronics. So usefulness at what scale and in which timeline is an important concept, I think. Mathematical theories are not useful, actually, when you look at them as a mathematical theory on their own, but then someone uses those mathematical theories and builds something, then it becomes useful from a certain perspective. So if we can clarify what we are heading to, what we would like to run after in terms of developing those neurotechnologies, it may be both, actually. We may have two branches throughout this NeurotechEU endeavor, so to speak, and run after both of them in parallel, actually. But let's clarify this.
So let me just make sure I understand what you mean. And this is I think it was a distinction that I also made, which is that we've been talking about technologies to gain further understanding about the workings of the brain. And the other one is to use technologies applied to interfacing the brain with our behavior in the world, right? So these are, so yeah, I think that's true, and we've kind of
not necessarily interface.
Well,
Right?
whatever terminology.
Not necessarily interface. Yeah. I mean, applying those technologies to understand something. I mean, we can maybe, for example, if we understand how the brain works to a certain extent at a coarser level, maybe we can actually understand how the dementia progresses in the brain. I mean, what changes in time and what type of discrepancies happen in the brain. Maybe there are some discrepancies happening in the brain, something like that. Okay, and then it becomes an application.
Sure. Yeah.
That's what I just meant.
Okay. So maybe there are three different things then, because I think if we think of the very strict terminology of neurotechnology is about sort of technologies that interface with the brain in order to measure it or to get it to talk to other things, right? So, but here what we've been talking really about is neuroscience in terms of like, you know, the using methods, neuroscientific methods, either to understand the brain or to understand that knowledge, as you said, Barak, in terms of understanding clinical applications or educational applications or other types of applications, right? So, yeah. So to me, that is a question that I have about the European University endeavor, the Neurotech, is that, you know, its kind of foundation is premised on using neuroscience and technology for ultimately a model of understanding education and human behavior, I guess. But I wonder to what extent they really think of that as central, or if that's just like, well, let's just start in a neuroscience area and forget about the application of neuroscience and technology to education, but let's just use neuroscience and technology as a seed of collaboration and, you know, education across borders, and then do the same in other areas. So that, to me, that's an interesting tension that I don't have very clear in my head.
I would go for the second one, actually. I mean, I would take the neuroscience as the seed and to work and to define relatively more fundamental problems without much considering the direct applications at the first stage. And then define a roadmap, actually.
Yeah, I just wonder whether that's what the people who, you know, originally wrote the grant thought or not. So I think that.
Well,
yeah.
I can't answer that.
It's just something that I'm curious about. And okay, so we do have a whole other set of questions that we could go on to explore. Maybe we could do that for a moment. So, Nick, if we can go, to the next thing. So this is a little bit related to some of the things that we've been talking about anyway. So our sort of workshop was really to think about neurotechnology and big data. So this is another way in which our field is changing dramatically. So, and it does link in with all these analytical advances that we've been talking about in terms of AI and different types of algorithms and analytics. So we are now collecting enormous data sets. So for example, I just chose an example, which is the UK Biobank. So in the UK Biobank, there is a testing of 1 million people and getting data from 1 million people, genetics, and then in 100,000 of these people, there's like brain imaging, in addition to other types of measures of heart and other types of imaging of other parts of the body. 10,000 of those people will come back to do repeated measures of imaging. So we're going to end up with, a massive number of genetic and imaging data from which we can, for example, look at rare disorders at sufficient numbers that we'll be able to study these well. So Nick, if you go, if maybe stay with that previous slide. So obviously if we can go back, Nick, sorry, it's my fault. So, this is just an example of some of the imaging that's being done on the biobank. So the imaging part of the biobank is being led by Steve Smith and a group in Oxford. And they've kind of done a really fantastic sort of set of imaging protocols to extract in a very short amount of time all different kinds of signals, diffusion, sort of vascular stuff, connectivity, resting state networks, activation in certain tasks, different types of structural measures. And so if we can go to the next slide, if with the imaging that they've done in each person, they can, through a pipeline of analysis, they can extract more than 2,000 what's called imaging-derived phenotypes, which are just different types of measures that some are about structure, connectivity, activity, combination of those things, vascular. And these becomes, like these large number of variables that you can then correlate and look at, what happens to the 40,000 people who develop dementia, and you can look at these imaging derived. So we're going to have these massive data sets at a very high, within individuals and then across large numbers of people. And more people are embracing these kinds of big data approaches. So for example, a few years ago, the person who was blanking on his name now, Hyman, who was one of the head of the psychiatry federation, I think, in the world, and he was also head of Society for Neuroscience around the same time, Steve Hyman. He said, look, let's forget about hypothesis-driven psychiatry. We've been trying to understand these psychiatric disorders forever. We've had lots of wonderful hypothesis-based ideas. They're all wrong. We're not getting anywhere. We haven't created new drugs. So let's just embrace this sort of real big data approach to addressing some of these really difficult and critical questions. So these kinds of things then create lots of tension and controversy and questions for us. So with that background, maybe I have some questions in the next slide, which is, is it right? Do we think it's right for mining of big data sets of these types to replace hypothesis-driven medical science? Is there a way that the two can work together? What's the best way that these things can work together? And also, how do we move between these really big data approaches to ultimately what we want to do is to treat individuals and to help individuals either with their health condition or, for example, children with learning difficulties, to help the whole person as an individual. So these are two big questions. And then these are other questions or things that I think about is I feel, and this goes a little bit to what Branka was saying, that neuroscientists, psychologists, cognitive scientists could do better at working together with other people, including big tech firms that have lots of big data, in order to sort of make sure that we have science and technology evolving together in a mutually informative way. But that's not, to my mind, that doesn't seem to be happening so productively at the moment. And then, of course, there's always, when you deal, especially with human data and big data, there's always lots and lots of issues in terms of the ethical governance of data. So those were just some questions in this area just to get us started. But I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question on some of the big data stuff.
May I go ahead?
Sure.
Just a remark beforehand. I am not sure what you catered with the big bio data bank, but I happened to join a meeting between the NIH and the, I guess, the Research Council of the United Kingdom 4 or 5 years ago. In the United States, as the data are obtained with taxpayers' money, it's open. I can, for instance, at this moment, access the Human Connectome Project data.
Yeah, the biobank is also open.
That wasn't the case. Yeah, okay. If they did that, it's a good thing. There are differences between economical structures of the different countries. And for some, it might be difficult to pay a fee for obtaining these kind of data. Having said that, you mentioned that they produced or they processed the data to obtain their outcomes. This has been the the software structure you mentioned, FSL, as I'm sure most of the attendees know about, has been the produce of long years of work by the Oxford group. On the other side of the Atlantic, you have FreeSurfer and other mechanisms that are doing that. Again, I'm going to play a little bit the math card here, but on the basis of all of these structures lies the mathematical foundation of image processing or whatever, maybe computational imaging, computational mathematics, whatever you call it. Having said that, this trend is not new in the sense on the cancer imaging side, for instance, United States incorporates at least two databases, one for imaging, the Cancer Imaging Archive, and the other for the genetic information, the Cancer Genetic Archive, if I'm not wrong with the name, TCGA.
Yeah, so I think what's different about something like, I mean, I agree with you that, you know, there are lots of big data sets, and I wasn't particularly wanting to talk about the biobank. I was just giving that as one example that's relevant to our field. But the thing that is specifically different about the biobank is that it's a holistic thing. So you can link brain to cardiac, to cancer, to genetics, which is, I think, you know, it's meant for people to look at these associations. You have lifestyle, some cognition. So it enables you to look at these comorbidities as well. So there are particularities, but the point is not to talk about, you know, the UK Biobank itself. No,
I was in general, but I'm sorry, maybe I talked about it too much, but what I wanted to say is that the existence of these databases is a great opportunity for people with tools at their hands, which can work on data. It might not be possible for every country to obtain such a data set. And if somebody, some mathematician or some engineer wants to work in his or her country about these data, there shouldn't be any issue. My view is that it's a great help for general science community. On the other hand, if you want to go too detailed about the project, at the end, you will need your own data. You might want to change a couple of things here and there when you're acquiring, you want to, for instance, work on brain imaging. You might want to change a couple of MRI acquisition parameters to get a different set of data.
Yeah, so that gets to this question that I had in the beginning, like what's the utility of big data, and where is there still a role for hypothesis-driven medical science? I mean, because to many extents, like people are feeling like, okay, let's just forget all hypothesis-driven science. Let's look at patterns. And that's happening not only within open data sets, like, you know, many medical ones like the UK Biobank, but also within sort of things like Facebook and other types of people who own big data, enormous data sets that they can look for patterns and things. And you know, I think the question is, how does big data science work alongside hypothesis-driven science, and what's the how are they of mutual benefit, and how can they best benefit society? I think that's, to me, that's the crux of the question. So.
The way I see, if you wish, it opens doors. If you have some rapid questions that you can fire and look for answers, available data sets will give you an answer. When you give the example of Facebook, we are more or less talking about human beings, and we are looking for some common behavior. My view of nature is that when you challenge it, I mean, it's enough for someone to work on the cancer research to see how complicated that disease is and how complicated the nature is. So at a certain level, after working with big data sets, I'm sure that the researcher will come to a point where the available data or the way it's acquired will be insufficient, and that researcher would like to go and obtain different kinds of data. That's why, in my view, existing databases are excellent for opening the avenues, but once you start walking in the avenue, you want to take a different street, then you're going to need to dig your own way out. That's the way I see it.
Okay, thank you. Do we have other questions or other different aspects that people want to bring to this, or different views? I think one thing that people have said is that, in a way, when it comes to, well, especially psychiatric and psychological disorders, they actually make things like cancer seem very, very easy, because I think to solve, because at least there you can see the pathology, you can see markers, you have something very concrete to start from. And I think the real challenge in some of the really difficult psychological dimensions, like mental health issues, is that these are the primary symptoms are subjective, and so you don't even know what the actual phenotype is. So you don't even have a very clear phenotype to guide the research, and I think that makes it hard. And I would imagine that that is similar to the challenge of applying knowledge to, for example, promoting education and educational difficulties in other types of cognitive areas. So I think it is going to be very interesting whether these big data sets at least give us some clues to start explore what might be worthwhile phenotypes for us to then sort of apply a more granular or hypothesis-driven approach. So sort of complementing what you said there, Alpine. Are there other comments or questions from people? I think we're running out of juice, but we still have some time if people want to bring up any other issues, or I don't see any more questions on here.
I can make a comment
Okay.
on what you just said. Yeah. You actually posed the question of big data versus personalized medicine. I mean, would big data help us going to personalized medicine? I see it like that. I mean, personalized medicine was the late stage of medicine in some fields. So, I mean, people started to think about and understand some diseases. And at some point, after some point, we started to talk about personalized treatments for these diseases. Whereas the psychiatric diseases, for example, is at a very early state, as you just said. We even do not know the exact phenotype. So we shouldn't actually care about personalized psychiatric treatments or something like that, okay? Let's just first understand the basis of it. Let's just pass through the first stages. And when we are working on the first stages, something that's, I mean, some commonalities that you would see in the whole population for a certain psychiatric disorder, for example, then the big data is the answer. I mean, it would certainly help us. So let's not worry about the personalized treatment when it comes to brain or psychiatric diseases.
You don't think we have some tools that can get us going in that direction? I mean, some people have argued just the opposite. I mean, I totally agree with you that, you know, it's very early days and the phenotypes are really difficult. But some people have argued that actually by applying some neuroscience measures and understanding sort of networks and systems and things that are compromised, or if we can actually do some kind of careful cognitive phenotyping in people, then because these are complex disorders that maybe sometimes are multiple things happening, that are interacting with one another, it actually does help to take a personalized approach. Even nowadays, even as we start the field, it might be a necessary way of making progress. But maybe that's different to what you were saying. I think maybe you were...
No, it's more or less, it's in the same line, it's parallel. What I would like to say is that, for example, as an engineer, if I cannot define something that I would like to detect and find, okay, one of the paths that I would pursue is anomaly detection. Okay, I do not know what I'm looking for, but I know what I am not looking for. I am not looking for normals. Okay, so whatever deviates from normals is something problematic that I should focus on. Okay, so in that sense, if I do not know what I am looking for psychiatric disorders, I would just go and try to model or understand the normals to the very best, and then look at the deviations, and then at least that would give me some focal points to focus on for psychiatric disorders. And at that point, those big data sources would certainly help, actually.
Yeah,
At
no,
least
I
model
agree.
the normal.
I agree with that. Yeah. So I think we all agree that, so it seems from what people are saying that we all agree that that it's great to have open access to these big data sets because it opens up science to everybody, not just to the few rich countries or institutions that can do it. And that these can be really helpful data sets for cracking really difficult problems where, for example, finding the right phenotypes is difficult, or for example, some very rare diseases where they happen in very few people. So actually being able to canvass people at that large scale is necessary to get sufficient cohort of people that could be studied in order to derive some of the symptoms and some of the dysfunctions. So that sounds good. Okay, I'm wondering whether we're totally out of juice or whether there's any more anything else that I don't see any additional new questions. I think Burak, I don't know how to pronounce Güçlü, mentioned that there's Neurotech has a lot of promise for people with disabilities and integrating that. I think that is something that we probably didn't discuss very much, but it's absolutely true. And that is a really important application, very practical and important one. Okay, I think if we're good, I'm gonna suggest that we actually take 10-15 minutes before we go back to the next session. If that's okay. Nick, do you wanna just in case I forgot to say something, you wanna put like the last slide on? So, oh, the penultimate, yeah. Okay, so I think that's the big the big question that I felt was framing our discussion, but we actually ended up discussing lots of things in more fundamental ways as well. So I hope you enjoyed some of the thinking. I've had lots of interesting thoughts. If I have to summarize things when we get back to the next session, I apologize if I don't capture everything, but I'm going to try to put together some strands that I think came across from our session, which I think a lot of them have to do with accessibility of things, and also being able to bring together and integrate different levels of analysis, different types of understanding in order to come up with better knowledge, but also better applications. So I think that's what I'll say. So I hope that will be okay, and see everybody very soon.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you for Branka and Marcel and all our other contributors.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Session.
Bye.
Bye.